On that stifling August morning, the people gathered in silence in front of the old Palace of Justice in Ouagadougou. The cracked facade of the building, covered in dust and grime, seemed a perfect symbol of the state of justice in the country. Rusted, corrupt, manipulated. Rumors swirled in every corner, whispers about a hearing that was far from ordinary, because this time it wasn't just any citizen on trial, it was Ibrahim Traoré, the same man who had stood up to generals, who had refused to bow to foreign powers, now stood before the dock, unjustly accused. They fabricated evidence, distorted statements, created a spectacle. But everyone knew, this wasn't a trial, it was a trap. The judge presiding over the case, known only as Monsieur Jamais, was a man in a tight suit, with a crooked smile and cold eyes. He carried on his shoulders the weight of decades of subservience. He had been rewarded countless times for his institutional loyalty, a loyalty that was never to the truth, but to power. That morning, he entered the courtroom with a veiled pleasure. His polished shoes clicked on the wooden floor as if keeping the rhythm of a parade of humiliation. He wanted to see Ibrahim broken. He wanted to be the name that would savor declaring guilty the man who dared to rise against the system. Traoré stood there unhandcuffed, with his hands steady in front of his body. He didn't smile, but his eyes were alight. He wore a simple raw cotton shirt, the same one he wore to meetings with farmers in the villages. It wasn't an act, it was his truth. Behind him, the crowd watched in silence, some with tears already in their eyes. Young people in t-shirts stamped with his face, elders who had traveled miles to witness it. They knew this was more than a trial. It was a test of spiritual endurance. The prosecution presented false evidence, bank deposits that never existed, edited audio, coached witnesses, and when Ibrahim asked to speak in his defense, the judge interrupted with a dry tone. "You will have your moment, if I allow it." A murmur of indignation rippled through the room. Traoré merely took a deep breath. He didn't retort. His eyes locked onto the judge's. And it was at that moment that Jamais decided to do what he seemed to have rehearsed for days. He attacked not only the accused, but his honor, his legacy, his people. "This court is not here to listen to populist speeches, Colonel. This is not your revolutionary platform. Here you are just another defendant, and perhaps the worst of them." Silence fell like a stone. Even the courtroom guards seemed uneasy. The insult was direct, calculated, cruel. But what was most unsettling wasn't the tone. It was the intent. The judge wanted to break him. He wanted to see him react with anger. He wanted to see him falter. But Traoré, with moist eyes and a deep voice, simply said, "If being loyal to my people is a crime, then I will be guilty with joy. But not for you, for them." And he subtly pointed to the crowd outside. Out there, despite the heat, hundreds were already kneeling in prayer, many in silence. Others holding banners with psalm verses and words like dignity, justice, and hope. It was as if the entire country was there, compressed in every breath. The following minutes were marked by absurd questions, deliberately irritating interruptions, provocations. In one of them, the judge raised his voice. "Answer, Colonel, or do you prefer to put on a show for your peasants out there?" This time, even the journalists present exchanged glances. A line had been crossed. It was public humiliation, broadcast in real time by small independent channels providing clandestine coverage. The defense attorney, an elderly man who had been a comrade of Thomas Sankara, requested intervention. But Jamais slammed his gavel with a provocative smile. "In this courtroom, I'm the one who shouts." And then came the unexpected moment. Traoré, calmly, pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. He asked permission to read an excerpt from an old speech by an African leader forgotten by history. Permission, unsurprisingly, was denied, but the silence had already spread. He read anyway. "When justice ceases to serve the people, it becomes an instrument of oppression. And when that happens, courts are no longer houses of law. They are houses of shame." It wasn't just the crowd outside listening. Behind the scenes, within the judicial system, there were young judges, outraged prosecutors, public servants who began to see something different in Traoré. A courage that didn't shout, it endured. Jamais leapt from his chair. He pounded the desk, shouted, called it an affront. But the more he yelled, the smaller he seemed. It was as if authority had switched sides. The room was no longer with the judge. It was with that simple man, with a steady voice and unshakable faith. It was at that moment that everything began to change. From the back of the room, a metallic sound echoed. The rear door opened. An army officer entered, followed by two other men dressed in black. They handed the judge a sealed envelope. He opened it right there. His face paled, his hands trembled. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at Traoré with a gaze that was no longer arrogant. It was terrified. The audience didn't yet know, but that envelope contained an order from the Supreme Court. The trial would be suspended, the evidence reviewed, and more than that, an investigation would be opened into the judge's own conduct. The entire room stood, not with shouts, but with reverence. Some began to cry. Others softly sang old hymns of freedom. Jammeh didn't say another word. He simply left the room, his face sweaty, his steps hurried, his gaze lost. Outside the courthouse, Ibrahim Traoré emerged in silence. He looked at the sky, then at the people, and simply said, "We haven't won yet, but today we resisted." That night, the city didn't sleep. It wasn't just a victory in the courtroom. It was a crack in the system, a spark of hope amid decades of oppression disguised as legality. Through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, young people danced. Mothers lifted their children to the sky in gratitude. Elders sat under the shade of trees recounting what they had seen, as if they had witnessed a miracle. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't celebrate. He retreated to a small room in an abandoned convent, far from cameras, shouts, and festivities. He was silent, kneeling, his forehead pressed against the cold cement floor, praying not for vengeance, but for clarity. He knew that this victory was just one piece in a much larger chessboard, a step taken on a road still full of traps. While the people celebrated in the streets, in dark offices and locked rooms, powerful men writhed in anger. Jammeh, the humiliated judge, had been suspended from his post indefinitely. But he wasn't alone. There were ministers who protected him, businessmen who profited from the injustices he signed off on, foreign diplomats who secretly funded the entire machine. To these men, Traoré was a virus, and the failed judicial process was just the first antibody they had tried to use. Now, gathered in a luxurious house on the outskirts of the capital, they plotted new plans. They wanted to tarnish his image definitively. If they couldn't break him in court, they would do it in the media, behind the scenes in the hearts of the people. Across the city, in a dry field, Ibrahim met with an old friend, a man of few words who had fought alongside him in earlier times. His name was Adama. He was blind in one eye, but saw more than most. The two walked among twisted trees, speaking softly, as if even the wind could be a spy. Adama warned, the coming days would be even harder. They knew their enemies wouldn't rest, but they also knew that the people had now awakened. And once awakened, the spirit of justice would not go back to sleep. Meanwhile, the national media split. Some channels, paid by foreign interests, launched a defamation campaign. They created distorted headlines, tried to link Traoré to radical groups, used edited images and bought testimonies. But the population, inoculated against lies, began to react. They created community networks, grassroots radio stations, YouTube channels broadcasting live truths that major outlets refused to show. In no time, an alternative network formed, a new kind of resistance, without weapons but with words, without violence but with courage. And then came the invitation that would change everything. An international human rights organization, after watching the trial footage, decided to invite Ibrahim to speak at a global conference. The theme, justice, courage, and African sovereignty. It was an unprecedented opportunity, not just to tell his side, but to show the world the reality behind the facade of stability. Initially, he hesitated. He sought neither fame nor recognition beyond his borders, but his closest advisors insisted it was necessary to show that the struggle wasn't just local, but universal, that the pains of Burkina Faso were also felt in Ethiopia, Congo, Haiti, the favelas of Brazil, and the outskirts of Paris. On the flight to Geneva, Traoré remained silent almost the entire time. He looked out the plane window with steady but pensive eyes. He carried a small Bible and a photo of a child holding a piece of bread, taken in a village he had visited years before. That image, more than any prepared speech, was what drove him. He didn't want to be celebrated. He wanted to be a bridge between suffering and change, between injustice and restoration. The auditorium was packed. Leaders, jurists, journalists, representatives of nations that ignored the African continent until it became useful for their businesses. And there, center stage, under a white spotlight, Ibrahim began to speak. He didn't read speeches. He didn't cite statistics. He simply recounted what he had lived through, the threats he faced, the silent betrayals, the day he was insulted in his own country for trying to protect his people. And when he finished, there were no immediate applause. There was silence, a deep silence, the silence of those confronted with truth and unsure how to react. And then, like a slow wave, the applause came. Long, firm, reverent. Many wept. Others looked at him with a mix of shame and admiration. Upon returning to his homeland, the reception was different. Now it wasn't just the people waiting for him, it was history. Because in that short period, something had shifted. The trial was no longer the center of the narrative. Now what mattered was what would come next. Young people were already organizing study groups on popular justice. Teachers were rewriting school curricula to include the events of that month as a milestone. And in various corners of the country, murals began to appear with the phrase, "The truth cannot be judged. It rises." Jammeh, meanwhile, vanished from public life. Some say he fled to France. Others, that he still lives hidden in a luxury estate. But no one listens to him anymore. His name became synonymous with shame, with everything the people decided to leave behind. And Traoré? He returned to walking through the villages, without escorts, without pomp. He sat with fishermen, talked with farmers, entered mud-brick schools, and asked children what they wanted to be when they grew up. And in nearly every answer, the word justice emerged. The seed was planted, but there was something more, something no one knew. Throughout the entire process, while being insulted, judged and defamed, Traoré kept a hidden notebook. In it, he wrote his prayers, his thoughts, and a letter. A single letter, addressed not to a politician, not to an ally, but to an enemy, the very judge who insulted him. The letter read, "If one day your eyes see the people as human beings and not as a mass, you will know where to find me, because even those who have fallen deserve redemption." Traoré knew. The true leader is not the one who defeats the enemy. It is the one who offers them a chance to become human again. In the final scene, the camera slowly pulls back from Ibrahim Traoré, walking alone down a dirt road at dusk, surrounded by golden fields. The sky, painted in hues of fire and hope, seems to whisper that the story is far from over. A child runs after him, holding a book with the word "Justice" handwritten on it. He stops, kneels, smiles, and says, "The future belongs to those who don't give up even when all seems lost." And then, as the light fades on the horizon, a voice whispers, "Because even in the dust, revolutions are born."